An argument that I hear a lot from theologians, and you guys have addressed this already, but I promise to ask the question exactly as it was presented to me. The argument is that the biblical stories are of real people, and these stories came first, and then the stories were mapped onto the stars. What do you say about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Now, let me let you go first, John, if you want to.
So I, again, being raised devoutly Roman Catholic, I not only just Roman Catholic, like Irish Roman Catholic, and so saying the Rosary once a week with my mother. I mean, so initially I was very much, as David describes it, as a literalist. I like that description because it's very accurate. But so I could see even when I was in late grade school that the stories were just I had a seventh grade nun that made us read the miracle stories back to back, and you in essence do a linguistic analysis of the stories, and you're like, wait a minute, there are discrepancies in these stories that show they can't be based on eyewitness testimony. So what I write about, is basically how these miracle stories can be traced to pictures in the stars. And then when you write, say, a certain still frame in the stars, say Orion taking his first step out onto the celestial sea, right? So, and his cuneiform title can be translated as Son of God, and it can also be translated as Pishishu, which means, anointed one, which is Christ. So I'm pretty sure that's how they may have connected Orion with Jesus. But the actual details in the story, all of the action in the story, can be found embedded in those cuneiform titles for Orion and the alternate readings for those cuneiform signs. And that's what I think the miracle stories of the Bible are. They get attributed to historic people, or thought to be historic people. So the Jonah story, what happens in Jonah with the sea, the big fish or the giant fish, and then later it's a sea dragon in the New Testament. What happens there is a celestial myth, but then it gets transposed onto, so the miracles in the stars, but the details that are described in that picture story in the stars are then attributed to a real guy that was a real historic Jewish prophet. That's my argument for those. I don't go into, as you do, David, I don't go into how that plays out in meaning in your everyday life. So maybe you could take it from any comments you have and take it from there.
Yeah, well, I appreciate what you just shared from your own background, and I appreciate the question and where it's coming from, because like I said, I was also literalist, trying very hard to take the Bible literally in my own life. As an adult, really, I was not raised in a strict Christian literalist approach, but it was kind of general Presbyterian, but I became much more literalist as a young adult, really, in the Army. So actually it ties into what you kind of said at the end, applying to your life. I was searching very hard for answers, and I do believe that the ancient myths, including the scriptures of the Bible, have those answers for us. And so I'm very sensitive to the fact that there are people, probably the person asking this question, who are, their identity is very connected to, they have found answers that help them in their life.
Yeah.
Because I believe these are talking about true principles. I believe they are actually talking about recovery of self. Okay. And I had written about that in many books before I came across some of these cutting edge modern healers and psychologists who really talk about it in a much more precise way. But I would talk about how, for instance, in the Gilgamesh epic, Enkidu is constantly, all the people are constantly saying, oh my goodness, what do they always say when they say Enkidu walking down the street? He looks just like Gilgamesh. They could be twins, except their stature is just like twin. And Gilgamesh loves Enkidu like a wife almost. It's like, what's going on here? Is this a literal story? It's about actually your own self. That's, there is a friend which sticketh closer than a brother, it says in Proverbs 30. I think it's Proverbs 30. Anyway, it might be 28, it might be somewhere else, but it's in Proverbs. You have a self from whom you've been separated, or from whom we often become separated through various reasons that psychologists can explain to us, that have often always to do with trauma, which is not always the way the word is thrown around, maybe a little too much, but suffice it to say that this happens without our knowing. It's a defense mechanism. We separate from who we are, even without our knowing. That's why the myths are pointing us back to who we are. Okay, I haven't necessarily addressed the question directly yet, but what I'm saying is I was doing all the kinds of things that if you were to talk to Dr. Gabor Mate or other of these healers who are experts in trauma and understand addiction, I was pursuing extreme things. I went to West Point, which is already a bit extreme, but then I got onto the parachute team, which is even a little more extreme, skydiving, free fall skydiving. And then I was kind of the guy who was pulling low, like at the age of 19. I wouldn't do that today, but my coaches, like I was doing it to the extent where my coaches said, Mathisen, you pull low like that one more time, you're off the team. Like pulling low is dangerous. It's like, do you have a death wish? What's your problem? I said, hey coach, I'd like to, I've got this parachute that's issued to me by the team. Could I take it down to the New River Gorge Bridge in West Virginia and jump off it? I know that parachutists do that. Well, Dave, you could do it once and then you'd be off the team. Like, what was in me? And also then later I went to the 82nd Airborne, which is, you can choose lots of divisions. I chose the 82nd Airborne. That's where I got really into more literalist Christianity. And in fact, even got baptized again, by my chaplain. So I was searching for something. So I understand this question. I was taking the Bible literally to the point where I got to the point where in grad school, where I had a very heavy workload, I got a master's also in literature on the way back to teaching at West Point. I had a huge load of things to read. Like, they'd give you something like, here's the Odyssey, read it by tomorrow kind of assignment. And I was not reading any secular literature on Sunday. I was not watching any NFL. I was just reading the Bible. So I became pretty intense. I became very identified with it. So I'm giving you this backstory because I understand where the question is coming from. When I read Hamlet's Mill, I was excited because I love myths and I love stars by the argument that the myths are based on the stars, except when they would say, oh, now let's turn to Samson. Samson is a grand tissue of absurdities. And I was like, hold on. I know Samson was a literal strongest man in the world. If God is omnipotent, he can make Samson able to do those things. End of story. So I resisted that part. So now this question comes along, well, what about the possibility that all these figures like Samson literally lived, maybe, there's some embellishments, or, if you're a real literalist like I was, no, there cannot be embellishments in the text. If it says Samson did that many foxes, tied their tails together and put firebrand, 301 night, sounds implausible, must be literal. Okay. Who are you to say that God didn't arrange the stars to reflect Samson's deed? Or that people didn't later say, oh, well, we could kind of see that those stars are kind of like Samson's, taking the jawbone. Because they talk about, that was one of the big things that triggered my journey, was they were talking about the jawbone of the ass. And I've talked about this in lots of places. You can go back and see videos if people are interested. But so who's to say that Samson didn't literally use a jawbone, and then we look up in the stars and find something that's kind of like a jawbone and map it on there? And the authors of Hamlet's Mill point out, they don't directly address this, but they talk about the jawbone, and they say, there's a jawbone in a South American myth where they use the jawbone of a tapir. A tapir is this kind of pig-like animal with a snout. And then there's a myth in New Zealand where Maui, the hero Maui, uses the jawbone of his grandmother as a weapon against a sunbird. So what's going on here? And they say, well, it's celestial. That jawbone is in the heavens. Now, I would say to this question, okay, so you're telling me Samson is literal. The myth in South America is just a myth. The myth in Maui, that's just a myth. But Samson was literal? Like, why? Why was Samson the literal one? Why wasn't Maui? Maybe Maui's literal, and Samson's just an imitation of Maui. These patterns emerge around the world. Babies put into the water. Who's the most famous one from Exodus? That would be baby Moses. His mother put him into the river. Among the reeds, she pitches over the ark with tar. Guess what? Sargon, I'm sure you're familiar with there's an actual text,
Sargon of
which is
Akkad.
quite ancient. Sargon of Akkad. My mother was a priestess. My father I never knew. Now, who does that sound like? We've got a unknown father. Like there's all kinds, this is a mythological pattern. The human mother, the divine father, she put me in the riverbed among the reeds. It's always among the reeds. There's a baby in Japan named Hiruko, which means leech child. He is put into the water by his parents. They cast him away, basically. He's born without bones. But these babies that are they're always among the reeds. Baby Maui is actually thrown into the sea foam among the jellyfish. The patterns are actually quite repetitive, and like reeds are mentioned, pitch is mentioned. Sargon of Akkad specifically says she sealed the top with bitumen or pitch. So, well, which one is it if you're a literalist? Are you telling me that Moses is literal, but Sargon is made up? Or that mothers are just floating their babies and pitching over the roofs? They all just happen to choose pitch and put them among the reeds. But then if I show you that there's an ark in the stars, and it's Ophiuchus, and on either side of Ophiuchus is the serpent halves that look like bulrushes or cattails, then which came first? Oh no, it happened, and then no. That's why it's around the world. There's babies, there's pitch, there's, I've actually talked about that story. I've got a course called the Celestial Bible Tour where I talk about the Moses stories. The crossing of the Red Sea, I can show it to you in the heavens. Now, you could say, okay, the crossing really happened literally, and then it just so happens that there's a constellation right there in the exact same spot, putting its rod out right at the point where they cross the Red Sea, and you can see it in the heavens. You could argue that, but why? Because it's really, you're clinging, I would say, to an explanation that's not the most likely explanation, because something or someone has told you, if it's not literal, it's not true. And I say, I never said it's not true. It's absolutely true. The story of Moses is true in what it's trying to tell us about reconnecting with self, but it is not literal. I don't need the Odyssey. I've said this a million times, but the Odyssey is like my favorite ancient myth. I get something out of it. Every time I read it, I get something new out of it. Am I wedded to the idea that Odysseus literally fought a cyclops, went through all those adventures, had the sirens, trying to seduce him, met with Scylla and Charybdis? No, I do not need Odysseus to have been a literal figure for Odysseus to be one of the most important figures in my mind. Hercules, Hercules was worshipped as a god by the Romans, but I don't know that they necessarily took all the stories literally. Or I like to use this one too, Achilles, baby Achilles. We got the Achilles heel. Achilles is dipped in either the Styx, river Styx, or in some versions, actually more versions, his mother was dipping him in the fire. And then his human father came in and said, "What are you doing? Get my baby out of the fire." It's one of these kind of failed attempts to make immortal. Well, we don't have any evidence in ancient times of the Achilles was dipped in a Styx faction going to war with the Achilles was dipped in fire faction. Oh no, you've got to accept that Achilles was dipped in a fire. Oh, I will never accept that. Achilles was dipped in the water and I will cut your head off. There's this virulent literalism is a function of a later disease or a later problem. The ancients actually, we have the writings of these ancient, Tacitus would go up to Germania. They wrote the Germania, famous. He said, "Oh, the Germans worship Mars and they worship Mercury." And you're like, "What are you talking about? The Germans worship Mars and Mercury?" Well, they have this god Mars. Well, he's talking about, well, they worship Tyr or Tu or Odin. And the ancients immediately said, well, that clearly corresponds to our Mercury. And that clearly, and they didn't have any problem with it. They just, Plutarch will do this all the time. Well, Typhon, he's talking about Set. Typhon murdered Osiris. What do you mean Typhon? Typhon's a Greek monster. Set murdered Osiris. Well, we know that it corresponds. They didn't have any problem. This is like a later mistake that it has to be literal in order to be true, that I don't believe it was ever intended to be literal. So I hope I've answered with a few examples that'll show, like if we've got babies being put in the water all around the world, which one's literal? Why not the one in Japan?
Yeah.